Hello everyone, welcome to our lesson on discrimination during the war. So our objectives are to explain the racial struggle that took place during the war and to analyze the decision to place Japanese Americans in internment camps and take a look at the objectives and standards if you would please. Okay, so you have two vocab words for this lesson, Congress of Racial Equality and Japanese American Citizens League. So I want you to think about this. Why would a government discriminate against certain people during wartime? What would be a possible reason or fear that a government may have that they would discriminate against certain people during wartime? And our essential question, what discrimination took place during the war in the United States? Alright, so even though many African Americans moved out of the South due to discrimination, they continued to face it in the North. James Farmer established the organization known as the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and this interracial group fought for civil rights and set up the first sit-in at a segregated restaurant. We're going to talk more about sit-ins later on in the course, but what a sit-in is when a lot of times African Americans and their white supporters would go to restaurants that were segregated or wouldn't allow African Americans to be served there, and they would sit at the counter or a table and not move or until they were served or treated equally. Okay, so this is what a sit-in was. So in 1943, there were many riots across the country due to race. In June of that year, there was a violent riot in Detroit. Whites and African Americans got into a fight, and it soon spread. And the violence lasted for 3 days. And it got so intense that President Roosevelt actually had to send in federal troops to resolve the issue. Now, by the end of it, 9 whites and 25 blacks were either dead or dying from the violence as a result of this riot in Detroit. African Americans soon realized that they needed more support, and by 1945, over 400 committees were established to support race relations across the country. Now, there was something else known as the Zoot Suit Riot, which involved Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans faced discrimination and violence as well, just like African Americans did. And the Zoot Suit Riots occurred in Los Angeles, California in 1943. What a zoot suit was it was a fashion worn by Mexican Americans, usually like a suit with pants and usually a very large brimmed hat as a symbol of rebellion. And a lot of times these young Mexican Americans wore this as a symbol of rebellion against traditional clothing and things like that. So white sailors stated that they were attacked by these Mexican Americans in zoot suits, so as a result of this, whites spread across the city, and the riots took place across the city for about a week, and they went to Mexican American neighborhoods and violently attacked Mexican Americans, wearing zoot suits and other things, and many Mexican Americans were beaten and violently attacked because of this. Like I said, this lasted for about a week. Okay, so the internment of Japanese Americans. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans were suspicious of Japanese Americans. They felt that these people could be spies for the Empire of Japan. They felt that maybe they could be planning another attack. And most Japanese Americans lived in Hawaii or along the west coast of the United States. Now, in 1942, the War Department ordered the removal of all Japanese Americans from Hawaii to internment camps, which were basically for a lack of better words, prison camps almost, but they were camps for these Japanese Americans to be placed in so the government could keep an eye on them and things like that. And President Roosevelt also issued an order calling for the removal of all Japanese Americans from California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona as well. So some 110,000 Japanese Americans were gathered up and sent to 10 internment camps. You can see a picture here of what these internment camps looked like. And then on the map on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see where these 10 relocation camps were at. And the main purpose of this was to move the Japanese Americans in from the coast into the middle part of the country supposedly to prevent them from, planning another attack against the United States. Now, with that said, there were never any official charges filed against Japanese Americans for the things they were accused of, like for spying or espionage or things like that. There were never any real specific charges filed against any of them. And with that said, in 1944, a Japanese American by the name of Fred Korematsu took the case against the internment of Japanese Americans to the Supreme Court. So he went to the Supreme Court to fight the government on this policy they had. So in Korematsu versus the United States, that was the name of the court case, the Supreme Court ruled that the government had the authority to remove certain people for the protection of the United States. So the Supreme Court agreed with the government and the government's policy of removing Japanese Americans to these internment camps because they said that it was for the protection and the benefit of the American people. Now, with that said, Japanese Americans were not going to be done fighting for the treatment they deserved. So after the war, the Japanese American Citizens League, or the JACL, formed to fight for compensation, or being repaid, for those who were placed in internment camps for their homes, businesses, and other valuables. Remember, when these Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes and businesses behind, a lot of them lost those things, and they may have lost other valuable things as well. So they were fighting to be reimbursed for the things that they had lost. Now, it took many years and a lot of hard fighting, but many Japanese Americans would receive payment for their losses from the government, and eventually the government of the United States is going to apologize for the treatment of Japanese Americans during the war. Alright, so let's wrap it up. So remember we talked about discrimination during the war. So African Americans and Mexican Americans faced discrimination and violence. We talked about a lot of the riots that were going on around the country due to different race issues during the war. And we also talked about the internment of Japanese Americans and the things that they faced that were certainly questionable about how they were treated during the war, about being placed in internment camps, and how they fought back for equal rights and equal treatment by the government and by the American people. Okay, so that's all I have for this lesson. So please make sure you answer the questions, make sure you submit them, and I will see and talk to you later.